A poor girl takes her parrot to a talent competition. Upon hearing it speak, the owner of the sponsoring company kneels down in tears. Please listen until the end to be amazed by this story. Nina clutched the worn wooden cage to her chest as she hurried through the rain-slicked streets, her threadbare shoes splashing through puddles. Inside, Paul, her beloved bright blue parrot, huddled against the bars, unusually quiet. The bird hadn't spoken a word since that strange morning when everything changed. "Just a little further," she whispered, more to herself than to Paul. The massive glass building of Catherine Industries loomed ahead, its windows gleaming like diamonds in the grey morning light. Today was the regional talent competition, sponsored by the company's owner, Oliver Brooks, known for his ruthless business practices and legendary wealth. Nina hadn't planned to enter. Living in a tiny apartment with her grandmother, scraping by on odd jobs and her grandmother's meager pension, talent competitions seemed like luxuries meant for others. But Paul had always been special, different from other parrots. The things he said, the way he said them. Nina knew there was something extraordinary about him. The security guard at the entrance eyed her suspiciously as she approached, taking in her worn clothes and the old cage. "Fine contestants. Entrance is around back," he said gruffly, pointing to a side alley. Nina nodded, used to such treatment, and made her way to the indicated entrance. Inside, the backstage area buzzed with activity. Children with expensive instruments, teenagers in sparkly costumes, and parents fussing over last-minute adjustments filled the space. Nina found a quiet corner and set Paul's cage on a folding chair. "Ty, please," she whispered to the bird. "Please speak today. Show them what you can do." Paul tilted his head, his intelligent eyes fixed on her, but remained silent. A harried-looking woman with a clipboard appeared. "Number 247, you're up in 5 minutes." Nina's hands trembled as she picked up the cage again. As she waited in the wings, watching the current act finish their juggling routine, she heard snippets of conversation from nearby staff members. "Mr. Brooks himself is in attendance today. First time in years he's shown up to one of these. Heard he's been acting strange lately." Nina's heart pounded. The owner of Catherine Industries was here. She hadn't expected that. The spotlight seemed suddenly more intimidating. The juggler finished to polite applause, and Nina heard her number called. Walking onto the stage, the bright lights nearly blinding her, she set Paul's cage on the provided table. The audience was a dark mass beyond the lights, but she could make out one figure in particular. A man in an expensive suit, sitting alone in the center of the front row, his face partially hidden in shadow. "My name is Nina," she began, her voice barely a whisper. Someone in the audience coughed. She cleared her throat and tried again. "This is Paul. He's very special." She opened the cage door, hoping Paul would emerge as they'd practiced. But the parrot remained inside, his feathers slightly ruffled. "Come on, Paul," she encouraged softly. "Show them." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Nina could feel the audience growing restless. The man in the front row leaned forward slightly. Then Paul finally moved, stepping to the cage door. He looked directly at the man in the expensive suit and opened his beak. What happened next would change everything. The parrot spoke, but not in its usual mimicry. The words that came out were clear, precise, and carried a weight that seemed impossible from a bird. More importantly, they were words that made Oliver Brooks, the ruthless titan of industry, fall to his knees in the aisle, his face wet with tears. Nina stood frozen, not understanding what was happening, but knowing she had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple talent competition. Paul's words had unlocked something long buried, something that would unravel a mystery that had haunted Oliver Brooks for years. And this was only the beginning. Chaos erupted in the auditorium. Security guards rushed forward as Oliver Brooks remained on his knees, his composed facade shattered. The other judges half rose from their seats, uncertain whether to help or maintain their distance from their notoriously private employer. Through it all, Paul the parrot remained perched at his cage door, watching the scene unfold with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold countless secrets. "Clear the room," someone shouted. Staff members began ushering the waiting contestants and their families toward the exits, but Nina stood rooted to the spot, her hand gripping Paul's cage as a guard approached her. "You need to leave," he said firmly, reaching for the cage. No, Nina pulled back instinctively. Paul stays with me. Let her stay. Oliver's voice, though shaky, carried authority. He had risen to his feet, straightening his expensive suit with trembling hands. Everyone else out, now. The auditorium emptied quickly, leaving only Nina, Paul, Oliver, and 2 guards who stationed themselves near the doors. The vast space felt eerily empty, the spotlight still burning bright on Nina and the parrot. Oliver approached slowly, his eyes never leaving Paul. Where did you get him? He asked Nina, his voice barely above a whisper. Nina clutched the cage tighter. My grandmother found him when I was small. He was injured. His wing. She trailed off, suddenly afraid. What had Paul said to cause such a reaction? The words had been unclear to her, spoken so quickly and in a voice she'd never heard from him before. Your grandmother? Oliver ran a hand through his greying hair. Where does she live? I need to speak with her. Before Nina could answer, Paul spoke again, in that same strange, clear voice. The old bookshop, Oliver. Remember the old bookshop? Oliver staggered back as if struck. Impossible, he breathed. That voice. Sarah? Nina's confusion deepened. Who was Sarah? And why did her parrot seem to know this wealthy businessman? Sir, one of the guards stepped forward. Should we call someone? Oliver waved him away, his eyes still fixed on Paul. Nina, was it? Would you and Paul join me in my office? There's something I need to understand. The elevator ride to the top floor of Catherine Industries was tense with unspoken questions. Nina observed Oliver's reflection in the polished doors. His face had aged years in minutes, deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes. He kept glancing at Paul, who had returned to his usual quiet state. Oliver's office suite occupied the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. He led them to a sitting area, gesturing for Nina to take a seat on an expensive leather couch while he paced before the windows. That voice, he finally said, turning to face them. It belonged to my wife, Sarah. She disappeared years ago, vanished without a trace. The police investigated, but nothing was ever found. No body, no evidence of foul play, just gone. Nina's heart pounded. But how could Paul... The bookshop, Oliver continued, more to himself than to Nina. It was our special place. Sarah owned it before we married. She loved that little store more than anything. But after we married, after Catherine Industries took off, he trailed off, lost in memories. Paul suddenly fluttered his wings, drawing their attention. You chose wrong, Oliver, the parrot said in that eerily familiar voice. The company or me, you chose wrong. Oliver sank into a chair, his face ashen. Sarah gave me an ultimatum. The company was expanding rapidly, consuming all my time. She said I had to choose, step back from the business or lose her. I thought she was being dramatic. I never imagined... Nina's mind raced. Could it be possible? Could Paul somehow be connected to Oliver's missing wife? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right before her eyes. My grandmother, Nina said slowly, found Paul behind an old bookstore. He was injured, barely alive. She nursed him back to health. Oliver leaned forward intently. Which bookstore? It's closed now. The building's been empty for years. It's on Cedar Street. Sarah's store, Oliver whispered. He stood abruptly, moving to his desk and pressing an intercom button. Thomas, bring the car around. And call Henry. Tell him to meet us at the old bookstore on Cedar Street. Immediately. Nina found herself swept along in the wake of Oliver's sudden determination. Within minutes, they were in his private elevator, descending to the parking garage where a sleek black car waited. The driver, Thomas, held the door as they climbed in, Paul's cage carefully secured between them. As they wound through the city streets, Nina studied Oliver's profile. The hard-edged businessman she'd heard about seemed gone, replaced by someone more vulnerable, more human. He noticed her watching and attempted a smile. I've spent years building this company, becoming one of the most successful men in the city, he said quietly. But I lost the one thing that mattered most. I've had private investigators searching for Sarah all this time, never finding a trace. And now your parrot appears, speaking with her voice, knowing things only she would know. They turned onto Cedar Street, and Oliver's breath caught. The old bookstore stood dark and abandoned, its windows dusty, the faded sign barely legible. A man in a suit, Henry, Nina presumed, waited on the sidewalk. As they approached the building, Paul became agitated, fluttering in his cage and making small, distressed sounds. Oliver produced a key from his pocket. "I kept it," he explained. Seeing Nina's questioning look, I could never bring myself to sell the building. The door creaked open, releasing the musty smell of abandoned books and forgotten memories. Dust motes danced in the beam of Henry's flashlight as they entered. The shelves stood empty, a few tattered volumes scattered on the floor. Their footsteps echoed in the hollow space. Paul suddenly let out a sharp cry, not in Sarah's voice, but his normal squawk. He pointed his beak toward a door behind the old checkout counter. Oliver strode toward it, his shoes crunching on debris. "The office," he said. "Sarah spent most of her time here." The door stuck slightly, then gave way with a groan. The small room beyond was cluttered with old papers and fallen ceiling tiles, but it was the far wall that caught everyone's attention. There, partially hidden behind a tilted bookshelf, was another door, one that shouldn't have existed according to the building's plans. Henry stepped forward with his flashlight, illuminating a small keypad next to the door. Oliver stared at it, his face a mask of confusion. "This wasn't here before," he said. "This isn't part of the original building." Paul spoke again in Sarah's voice, softer now. "You always said you'd figure out my secret, Oliver. Here it is." Nina watched as Oliver approached the keypad with trembling fingers. What secrets lay behind that hidden door? What had Sarah been hiding all those years ago? And how did Paul know about it? The mystery was about to deepen even further, and Nina realized she was now irrevocably part of whatever was about to be discovered in this dusty old bookstore. Oliver stood before the keypad, his hand hovering over the buttons. The dust-filled beam of Henry's flashlight illuminated the small device, revealing years of undisturbed accumulation. Nina held Paul's cage closer, feeling the tension radiating from everyone in the room. "I don't know the code," Oliver admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. He turned to Paul, desperation evident in his eyes. "Sarah, if you can—" Paul tilted his head, studying Oliver with those knowing eyes. Then, in Sarah's voice, he spoke. "Some things never change. Still can't remember the important dates." Oliver's face transformed with sudden understanding. His fingers moved across the keypad decisively, punching in a sequence of numbers. A soft click echoed through the musty room, followed by the groan of long-dormant mechanisms coming to life. "The day we met," Oliver explained quietly, "at the coffee shop next door. She always said it was the most important day of her life." The hidden door swung inward slowly, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and surprisingly fresh, suggesting some kind of ventilation system. Henry stepped forward with his flashlight. "Sir, let me go first." But Oliver was already moving, taking the stairs with determination. Nina followed, careful with Paul's cage, while Henry brought up the rear, his light casting jumping shadows on the walls. The staircase led to a space that made them all stop in amazement. It was a room, roughly the size of the bookstore above, but unlike the abandoned shop, this space felt alive. Dust-covered shapes resolved themselves into computers, filing cabinets, and walls lined with documents. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface neat and organized despite the years of abandonment. "What is this place?" Nina whispered, but Oliver was already moving through the room, his hands trailing over surfaces as if trying to absorb their secrets through touch alone. "She was investigating something," he said, picking up a folder from the desk. "All those late nights she said she was doing bookstore inventory." His voice trailed off as he began reading. Paul suddenly became agitated in his cage, fluttering from perch to perch. His voice, when it came, was Sarah's, but filled with urgency. "The proof is here, Oliver. All of it. What they were doing to those families." Oliver's head snapped up. "What families? Sarah, what are you talking about?" Nina set Paul's cage on a nearby table and moved to look at the documents Oliver held. They were financial records, but not the kind you'd expect to find in a small bookstore. These were complex, detailed reports about property acquisitions, resident relocations, and compensation packages, all bearing the Catherine Industries logo. "These are from my company's urban renewal project," Oliver said, frowning as he flipped through the pages. "We bought up properties in the old district, rehabilitated the area. It was one of our biggest successes." "Success for who?" Paul spoke in Sarah's voice, sharp with accusation. "Look closer." Henry had found a switch, and fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, revealing the true scope of the room. The walls were covered not just with documents, but with photographs, hundreds of them. Families standing in front of old buildings, children playing in streets that no longer existed, elderly couples on worn but loved porches, and newspaper clippings. Local residents protest evictions, community leaders question compensation rates, historical district faces modern development. Oliver moved slowly along the wall, his face growing paler with each image he absorbed. "These people. We followed all the legal requirements. The compensation packages were fair." "Fair?" Paul's voice, Sarah's voice, cut through the room. "They lost everything. Their homes, their communities, their history. Also, Catherine Industries could build luxury condos and shopping centers. You didn't see them, Oliver, but I did. They came to the bookstore, telling their stories, crying over what they'd lost. And when I started looking into it..." The voice trailed off, leaving the room in heavy silence. Oliver had reached the desk again, and now he opened another folder with trembling hands. Inside were more documents, but these were different. Internal memos, private emails, financial records that never made it to official reports. "The compensation packages," he whispered. "They were calculated wrong, deliberately wrong." He looked up at Henry, his face ashen. "Did you know about this?" Henry shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, that was before my time, but I'd heard rumors." "Rumors," Oliver's voice rose. "Though these people were cheated out of their homes, and my company. He sank into the desk chair, the weight of revelation crushing down on him. Nina watched as the powerful businessman seemed to shrink, becoming smaller and more vulnerable with each passing moment. "This is what Sarah discovered," he said quietly. "This is what she was investigating. And when she confronted someone about it..." Paul fluttered in his cage again. But this time when he spoke, it wasn't Sarah's voice they heard. It was a man's voice, cold and businesslike. "You're becoming a problem, Mrs. Brooks. I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Oliver's head snapped up, his face draining of color. "Thompson," he whispered. "My CFO at the time. He retired right after Sarah disappeared." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they only led to more questions. What had happened to Sarah after she discovered the truth? How had Paul come to know these voices, these secrets? And most importantly, where was Sarah now? Nina moved to the desk, drawn by something she'd noticed earlier. Unlike the rest of the room, the desk's surface was relatively clean, as if it had been used more recently than everything else, and there, partially hidden under a folder, was a small notebook. She picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. The handwriting inside was neat and feminine, the ink still fresh enough to suggest it wasn't years old like the other documents. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, holding out the notebook. I think someone's been here recently." Oliver took the notebook with unsteady hands. As he read the first page, his eyes widened, and a single tear traced down his cheek. "It's Sarah's handwriting," he whispered, "and it's dated. It's dated just months ago." The notebook trembled in Oliver's hands as he turned the pages, his eyes scanning Sarah's elegant handwriting. Nina watched his face transform with each line he read, hope and fear battling across his features. Paul remained unusually still in his cage, his bright eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. "She's alive," Oliver whispered, his voice cracking. "All this time she's been alive." He looked up at Nina, then at Paul, his eyes swimming with tears. "She's been hiding, protecting herself while gathering evidence. This notebook, it's all here. Every detail of what happened that night." Henry stepped forward, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Sir, perhaps we should call the authorities." No! Paul's sudden outburst in Sarah's voice made them all jump. Not yet. Not safe. Oliver nodded slowly, returning to the notebook. Sarah writes that Thompson wasn't working alone. There were others involved in the property scheme, people with powerful connections. When she threatened to expose them, he trailed off, his hand clenching into a fist. Nina moved closer to the desk, drawn by the intensity of the moment. But why didn't she come to you? Why hide for so long? Because I was part of the problem, Oliver admitted, his voice hollow. I was so focused on the company's success that I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. She tried to tell me about the residents, about their struggles, but I dismissed her concerns, called her too emotional, too invested in people she barely knew. He looked up at Paul. I failed her, in every way possible. Paul ruffled his feathers and spoke again in Sarah's voice, softer this time. The bookstore was never just a store, Oliver. It was a sanctuary, for me, for them, for everyone who needed one. Nina's grandmother had often spoken about the old bookstore, about how it had been more than just a place to buy books. It had been a community hub, a safe space where people could share their stories and find support. Now those words carried new meaning. Oliver stood abruptly, moving to one of the filing cabinets. These records, Sarah's been updating them. Recent photographs, new documents. He pulled out a folder, spreading its contents across the desk. She's been tracking Thompson and the others, documenting their continued schemes in other cities. Nina leaned over to look at the photographs. They showed familiar faces in expensive suits, handshakes being exchanged in shadowy doorways, envelopes changing hands in parking garages. Sarah had been busy during her years in hiding, building a case that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. But where is she now? Nina asked, voicing the question that hung heavy in the air. Paul suddenly became agitated, hopping from perch to perch in his cage. When he spoke, it was in a rapid succession of voices, Sarah's, Thompson's, and others they didn't recognize, fragments of conversations, arguments, threats made in dark rooms and empty streets. Oliver gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. She's trying to tell us something, these voices. Paul must have been there, must have witnessed. Nina's mind raced back to when her grandmother had found Paul, the injured wing, his strange behavior, the way he would sometimes wake in the night, screaming in different voices. They had assumed he was just mimicking random sounds he'd heard. But now, oh, the old warehouse, Paul suddenly said in Sarah's voice, where it all started, where it has to end. Oliver's head snapped up. The Riverside warehouse. It was the first property in the development project. Thompson insisted we start there, said it was strategic. He turned to Henry. Get the car and call someone we can trust at the police department. No one else. As they hurried up the stairs and back through the dusty bookstore, Nina's mind whirled with questions. What would they find at the warehouse? Was Sarah there? And what about the people who had forced her into hiding? Were they still watching, still waiting? The drive through the city seemed to take forever, though Thomas navigated the streets with skilled efficiency. Oliver sat rigid beside Nina, the notebook clutched in his hands, while Paul remained uncharacteristically quiet in his cage. The warehouse district was a study in contrast. Some buildings had been converted into luxury apartments, while others stood abandoned, their windows dark and empty. Thomas pulled up to one of the latter, its brick facade still bearing the faded name of a long-defunct company. Wait here, Henry said, stepping out first to survey the area. After a moment, he nodded, and Oliver helped Nina from the car, Paul's cage held carefully between them. The warehouse door was locked, but Oliver produced another key from his pocket. I keep all the old property keys, he explained quietly. Never could bring myself to get rid of them. The door opened with a protesting groan, revealing a vast, empty space. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as they entered, Henry's flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with dust and the lingering smell of river water. Paul suddenly began to tremble in his cage, his feathers puffing out in distress. When he spoke, it was in a voice they hadn't heard before, younger, frightened. Please, you don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone. I promise. Oliver stopped dead in his tracks. I know that voice, he whispered. Lisa Chen. She was one of the community organizers who opposed the development. She disappeared around the same time as Sarah. Before anyone could respond, a new sound echoed through the warehouse. Footsteps, coming from the shadows beyond Henry's flashlight beam. They all turned toward the sound, hearts pounding. A figure emerged slowly from the darkness, and Nina heard Oliver's sharp intake of breath. The woman was older than in the photographs that covered the hidden room's walls, her hair now streaked with grey, but her eyes held the same intensity that had captured Oliver's heart so many years ago. "Sarah," Oliver breathed, taking a step forward, but Sarah raised a hand, stopping him. "We're not alone," she said quietly, her real voice matching the one they'd heard from Paul. "They followed you here, just like I knew they would." More footsteps echoed through the warehouse, and shadows began to move in the darkness around them. Nina clutched Paul's cage tighter, feeling the bird trembling against the bars as the trap they'd walked into began to close. The warehouse air grew thick with tension as more figures emerged from the shadows. Nina recognized one immediately from the photographs. Thompson, older now, but still carrying himself with the same cold authority. Behind him, two men in expensive suits moved to block the exit. "I must admit," Thompson said, his voice exactly as Paul had mimicked it, "this is quite the reunion. Though not quite what we planned." He glanced at Sarah with a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect. "You've been rather troublesome, Mrs. Brooks." Oliver stepped forward, placing himself between Thompson and Sarah. "You knew," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "You knew she was alive all this time." "Of course we knew," Thompson replied smoothly. "We've been watching her for years, cleaning up her little attempts to expose us, though I must say, the Parrot—" He turned his cold gaze to Paul, who huddled in his cage. "That was an unexpected complication." Sarah moved to stand beside Oliver, her head held high. "Paul was my insurance policy, my way of making sure the truth would come out, even if something happened to me. I never expected him to find his way to someone who would bring him right to Oliver." She smiled slightly at Nina. "Sometimes fate has its own plans." Nina felt the weight of everything suddenly. How her grandmother finding an injured parrot had unwittingly made her part of something so much bigger. Paul stirred in his cage, and when he spoke, it was in a cacophony of voices, snippets of conversations, deals made in secret, threats delivered in dark corners. Each word seemed to make Thompson's face grow darker. "Enough," he snapped. "This ends tonight. All the evidence on everything you've gathered, it dies here. And this time, Mrs. Brooks, we'll make sure you can't leave any more clever little breadcrumbs behind." Henry moved forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket. But one of Thompson's men was faster, pulling out a gun. "Don't," Thompson warned. "My associates are quite professional, and I'd hate to add more bodies to tonight's cleanup." "You're wrong about one thing," Sarah said calmly. "This does end tonight, but not the way you think." She pulled something from her pocket, a small device that looked like a remote control. "Did you really think I'd wait all these years, gather all this evidence, just to walk into a trap unprepared?" She pressed a button, and suddenly the warehouse was flooded with light. Nina blinked against the sudden brightness, and as her eyes adjusted, she gasped. The empty warehouse wasn't empty at all. The walls were lined with cameras, their red lights blinking steadily. And more figures were emerging, not Thompson's men, but people with badges, weapons drawn. "Federal agents," one announced. "Everyone stay where you are." Thompson's face contorted with rage as he realized what was happening. Me," Sarah finished for him. "And not just me. Every person you've hurt, every family you've destroyed, they've all been waiting for this moment." She turned to Oliver, her eyes softening. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I couldn't risk anyone finding out until we had everything in place." Oliver reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I understand. I failed you once, failed all these people. I won't fail them again." As the agents moved in to make arrests, Paul suddenly spread his wings wide and spoke one last time in Sarah's voice. "The truth always finds its way into the light." Nina watched as Thompson and his men were led away in handcuffs, their faces a mixture of rage and disbelief. The warehouse had become a hive of activity, agents documenting evidence, taking statements, piecing together the final parts of a case that had been years in the making. Sarah turned to Nina, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said softly, "for taking care of Paul, for bringing him to Oliver. We had everything we needed to make the arrests, but I needed Oliver to understand, to see the truth for himself." Nina looked down at Paul, who was now contentedly preening his feathers as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "But how did he learn all those voices? How did he know what to say?" Sarah smiled, reaching out to stroke Paul's feathers through the cage bars. "He was my constant companion during those years of investigation. Parrots are incredibly intelligent, and Paul, he absorbed everything. Every meeting I recorded, every conversation I witnessed, he became my living record of the truth." Oliver, who had been speaking with one of the agents, returned to them. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has been building this case for years," he said, his voice filled with wonder and regret. "All those families, all those lives we destroyed. Sarah was right all along. And now you can make it right," Sarah said gently. "Together." Nina watched as Oliver pulled Sarah into a tight embrace, years of separation and misunderstanding dissolving in a moment of truth and reconciliation. Paul chirped softly in his cage, a happy, normal parrot sound that made them all smile. But there was something in Sarah's eyes, a shadow that suggested this night's revelations weren't quite complete. As if reading Nina's thoughts, Sarah turned to her with a serious expression. "There's one more truth that needs to be told," she said quietly. "About your grandmother and why she really found Paul that day." In the now quiet warehouse, Sarah led Nina to a quiet corner, away from the bustling federal agents. Oliver followed, his hand never leaving Sarah's, as if afraid she might disappear again. Paul watched them all with his intelligent eyes, unusually calm in his cage. "Your grandmother," Sarah began softly, "wasn't just someone who randomly found an injured parrot. She was my friend, my ally, one of the few people I could trust completely." Nina's mind raced back to all the times her grandmother had told her about finding Paul, how she'd always had a distant look in her eyes when speaking about the old bookstore. "She knew, all this time?" Sarah nodded. "She was one of the community leaders who first came to me about the unfair evictions. When I discovered the truth about Thompson and the others, she helped me set up the hidden room beneath the bookstore. And when they threatened my life," Sarah paused, collecting herself, "your grandmother helped me disappear. The night I had to leave," Sarah continued, "I knew they were watching me. I couldn't take anything with me, no evidence, no proof. But Paul—" She reached through the cage bars to stroke the parrot's feathers. "Paul had heard everything. Every meeting, every threat, every secret conversation. He was my insurance policy, but I couldn't keep him with me. It would have been too suspicious." "So you planned it," Nina whispered, understanding dawning. "You arranged for my grandmother to find him." "Yes. She was supposed to keep him safe until the right moment, until we had enough evidence to bring everything to light. But then—" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "First, when I heard she'd passed away, I thought all hope was lost. I had no way of knowing if Paul was safe, if he still remembered." Oliver squeezed Sarah's hand. "But Nina took care of him, and somehow he knew exactly when to reveal everything." Because he recognized Oliver's voice, Nina realized. From all those years ago, from the recordings. Sarah smiled. "Paul always was extraordinarily intelligent, but more than that, he understood the importance of timing, just like your grandmother did." Nina felt tears forming in her eyes as she thought of her grandmother, how she'd always insisted on keeping Paul even when money was tight, how she'd made Nina promise to take care of him no matter what. "She never told me." "She was protecting you," Sarah said gently. "The less you knew, the safer you were. But she made sure Paul would be there when the time was right. She never lost faith that justice would prevail." A federal agent approached them respectfully. "Mrs. Brooks, we need your statement now, and Mr. Brooks, we'll need to discuss the company's cooperation with the investigation." Oliver straightened, his face set with determination. "Of course, every record, every document, whatever you need to make this right." "And after?" Sarah asked softly, looking up at him. "After, we rebuild," Oliver said firmly. "Not just buildings this time, but communities. The right way." He turned to Nina. "Starting with making sure every family we displaced is properly compensated. Your grandmother's legacy will be honored." Nina opened Paul's cage, and for the first time that night, he hopped out willingly, flying to perch on Sarah's outstretched arm. He looked at them all and spoke one last time in Sarah's voice. "Sometimes the longest road leads us exactly where we need to be." Sarah laughed softly, tears running down her cheeks. "I think that's the last time we'll hear those old recordings. Paul's done his job, more perfectly than I could have ever imagined." In the days that followed, the story unfolded across headlines and news reports. Thompson and his conspirators faced justice, their years of corruption exposed to the light. Oliver, with Sarah by his side, transformed Catherine Industries, establishing a foundation dedicated to community development and restoration. Nina's grandmother's old apartment was converted into a community center, with a special room filled with books, a continuation of the sanctuary Sarah's bookstore had once provided. And above the entrance, in a beautiful cage that was always open, lived Paul, now speaking in his own voice, bringing joy to children who came to read and learn. Sarah and Oliver rebuilt their life together, their love stronger for having weathered the storm of separation and truth. They became regular visitors to the community center, where Oliver would often be seen reading to local children, while Sarah and Nina worked together to ensure that the lessons of the past were never forgotten. As for Nina, she found her own purpose in continuing her grandmother's legacy of quiet courage and unwavering faith in justice. She understood now that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of kindness and the patience to wait for truth to find its moment. And Paul, the extraordinary Parrot who had carried the weight of truth through the years, no longer needed to speak in borrowed voices. His own happy chirps and playful words were enough, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful secrets are kept by the most unexpected guardians. In the end, it wasn't just a story about a parrot who spoke with a missing woman's voice. It was a testament to the power of faith, patience, and the unbreakable bonds between people who choose to stand for what's right, no matter how long the journey may be. As Oliver often said, looking at the thriving community that had risen from the ashes of corruption, the truth doesn't always take the path we expect, but it always finds its way home. And in the gentle evening light of the community center, as children gathered to hear Paul's cheerful chatter and Sarah's stories, that truth had indeed found its way home, in all the ways that mattered most. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.